You tell me it started with your own people, meaning the other brown kids at school. With both parents from Ghana, your origins were not common and therefore subject to ridicule. Boku and Freshi were the terms used to point out you were somehow animalistic, blacker. And as the classroom laughed, they never questioned whether that distinction was even their idea. With divide and conquer as one of the oldest tools for masking fear, you learned that being a dark-skinned African was not going to be so easy here. You tell me when you were younger, your family moved to Britain. And if you had any illusions of better fitting in, you were in for a knock. Because darker skin was still like sin between a hard place and a rock. But structures made of brick and stone are known to contain heat. A kindled flame from the sticks thrown at your bones became a place within you to retreat. And I imagine that's how you defeat the specter of race. By giving it air in a controlled space, becoming a fireplace. Releasing hot waves of energy, your words give voice to unsung legacies. You tell me your parents always had music in the house. Your mom's singing showed you the power of voice to reach. And as a pastor, your father's gospel modeled how to preach. You describe a memory of sitting in the back of your dad's car, hymns of worship washing over you. I imagine this was when your rap craft had begun. It reminds me of your namesake from the Bible, David, the shepherd's son. He was the one chosen to become king. But before he conquered Goliath with his sling, he watched over his father's flock and learned to sing, writing rhymes in the fields that turned into psalms, a soothing practice in keeping the mind calm. For a fire left to rage maims and mars. So you vent it in your rap, avoid that trap, and spit bars. You mention you're drawn to music that lifts the spirit, and that's what you intend to do with it. Share messages that people can actually use. And I think of all the points of view that came before you. Black gold sold on the Atlantic coast. A sea of mysteries submerged in histories. And in my mind's eye, I see a reason to amplify sound. A distant hum rising from the depths, undrowned. A beat bursts from your chest via the mic to the speakers. And I imagine a bonfire circle complete, your forebears providing the fuel and you bringing the heat. I ask you about your experiences with whiteness. You say you encounter it when trying to advance in life, at school, at work. You'd have to blind yourself to not see it. You notice you are perceived in a certain way and you have to train yourself to not be it. You wear Africa on your skin, the very soil of Dutch and British exploitation. But despite your country of origin, the West is the environment you grew up in. So you come with all that plus more. And when you enter a room, your aura is not small. I imagine it must be intimidating, and I ask you what you think it's all rooted in. You say it must be insecurity on their part, fear that you might be the one to spark a change, a tipping of the scales that have been weighed for so long in their favor. You tell me you cannot let it deter you and simply continue diligently. It's hard to make people see what mostly take place subliminally. You say those reaping benefits may not be aware of the flip side of their advantage. And I think about how that leaves it only to the other side to feel the damage. It strikes me that even as the bent system prevails, fire in full bloom blazes a trail. Lastly, you tell me you grew up feeling that your mother had the best singing voice. You say it's one of the main reasons why you do what you do. It made you feel good, and that's what creating rap does too. And I think about music's power to soothe, how rhyme and rhythm whispers to the nervous system. Like a steady flame softens the toughest bark into ash. Hardened crust cracks, releasing curling smoke. Like incense, it evokes peace, a collective release of social tension, and the weight and glory of living life while appearing African.
Thank you very much, Julia Beth, for that performance of your poem Fire. Thanks. From the series CCC, Colour Craft Collective. So thank you for that wonderful start and welcome, everyone. It's great to see so many faces and smiles. And welcome to those joining on the stream. Thank you for being here virtually. So, we have a great discussion ahead of us, and I'm going to start by introducing the wonderful panelists that we have here today. So, to start, Farren van Wyk is a Dutch and South African photographer and educator. She holds a BA degree in photography and an MA in cultural and visual anthropology. She's a member of the African Photojournalists Association with Well Press Photo, Women Photograph and Black Women Photographers. And her work has been featured internationally by ID, The Washington Post, Photo Vogue, De Graaf, and The Times UK, to name a few. Please make sure to look at Farren's website. Next up, we have Christl Wolfram. Is an art historian and a student from the University of Amsterdam, with a deep-rooted fascination for decolonial theory in the art sector. Hailing from the culturally rich Suriname, she aspires to explore and illuminate the intricate interplay of colonial history and its profound impact on the identity of Caribbean communities. Her aim is to achieve a new Caribbean narrative that sheds light on the complexities of art, history, and identity. And finally, we have Julia Beth Harris, who writes and creates text and performs them, with a background in graphic and fashion design. Her words embody a visual, multi-layered quality, as you have just seen. Having identities on different continents, Southern Africa and Northern Europe, Julia Beth's work serves as a bridge between cultures, bringing together international communities with grace, intellect, and calmly commanding stage presence. And finally, my name is Guy Macondo Wills. I'm a British South African documentary photographer and educator based in the Netherlands. My work concerns identity, race, colonization, and stories of marginalized communities. my practice is driven by collaboration and challenging Eurocentric visual culture. I'm a lecturer in the Royal Academy of Art in The Hague, the KBK, and I also host the Photodoc book talks at Tivoli in Utrecht. So, without further ado, introductions never quite do people justice. That's why I feel very blessed to be here with all of you. So, the event today, Liquid Traces, Replacing Our Borders. I'm sure you all read the description, but it is an open discussion on the themes of the African diaspora's liquid roots and how artistic expressions act as both resistance and reconciliation. Together, we will delve into the complexity of the African diaspora's liquid roots, tracing their path from Africa to the Americas, Caribbean, and the West. This conversation is going to discuss how these connections shape our identities as a part of the diaspora and how they're reflected in the panelists' art. Our panelists will highlight how artistic expression acts as both resistance and reconciliation, helping us interpret our past and maintain ties to our cultural roots. So I want to preface this by also saying that this is very much an open discussion. So please feel free, if you feel inspired to add anything, talk, please do. There is going to be Seem here, who is waving her hand with a mic. So please raise your hand if you want to say anything. The more the merrier, the more voices, the better. I guess my first question is seemingly an obvious one. But the term liquid traces, I think when I first read it, it brought up many things. And in many of our discussions, there were so many different interpretations to what this meant to us. So I guess, what does this term mean to you within the context of today, but also, you know, within your practices overall? Any of you are welcome to start. Farren.
Soothing, I think so. If we just go back to the basic, from liquid traces to water to maybe the ocean, especially in South Africa, unfortunately not so much over here in Netherlands. Once I step into the ocean at home in Port Elizabeth, I feel soothed, and I just let the water wash over me. And I also feel reborn and ready to continue the work, because whatever chaos comes in with that just all ebbs away, as if the ocean takes it with it, and I get to continue in that with what I do. In that kind of sense. So, yes.
And on the other side of the coast, where the Atlantic Ocean meets Cape Town, the water is very cold. So when I go back home and I feel that cold like wrapping around my ankles, I feel like it's got me. Like, you know, I feel, and I actually say, "Hi, Mom," because I just feel like I'm home. But also with regards to liquid traces, I had to think about how the indigenous Khoisan South African people were also nomadic, and they also flowed with the land and with the seas and didn't really settle until settlement and settlers came. And so in terms of liquid traces, I feel like there's a heritage there that doesn't have to mean scattered or not unified. It can also mean in flow with what is the flow of the universe, which is I went far there.
That's great. That's what we're here for, please.
But it doesn't, I think what I'm getting at is that it doesn't have to mean disparate. It can also be united with all that is. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's for me definitely also going into my academic research, I feel how I'm divulging into discovering my identity through what I'm reading and what I'm researching about, and the cultural significances of art being a representative of my culture, and seeing traces not only of Western culture but our indigenous relations with that. So in that sense, the fluidity of that comes to mind. Yeah.
Those are really interesting points, and I wanted to touch on this idea you said about traces, the difference between traces, and also that we maybe associate it with something which is separate and something which is fragmented.
Yeah.
And you mentioned, I guess, this movement, this also pre-colonial movement with the land, with the earth, with the tide, with the seasons.
The elements.
With the elements, exactly. And I wanted to actually ask you about how that plays into your writing, the elements.
Yeah. So the first poetry series that I did was based on the elements, and this piece, Fire, was one of those 5 poems. But it was a way for me I tried to make sense of blackness, and unpack my own blackness. And I think for anybody who unpacks that, it's the more you try to define it, the more the threads just loosen, and the more undefined it becomes, and the more you realize, oh, it's infinitely spacious and defines me and doesn't at all. And I think I couldn't find answers and definitions only within me. So what I did was find 5 creatives of color in my community who also had experiences with blackness, but from different angles. So David was Ghanaian, there was a Surinamese girl. And I chose 5 of them and assigned each one of them the elements, and that sort of tied it together for me in the way that water, for example, also ties together things. The way that water can be ice, it can be vapor, it can be liquid, and it can take the shapes of other things. And filtering this very complex, intangible topic of blackness through the elements gave me something to hold on to, and also nothing to hold on to at the same time, which was the most freeing part of the endeavor.
That's wonderful, thank you. And we also have in the audience today the director of the festival, Jay Betta. And I was wondering if I could ask you what Liquid Traces was for you in the senses of, I guess, giving the festival this edition, this title.
Okay, thank you. The interpretations that you all provided were really wonderful. The festival thinks about a theme on an annual basis. And last year, if you remember, your minister made the announcement of the apology for slavery. And so we were going to come up with a theme called I am very, 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 very sorry. But we decided to be a bit more restrained. So we came up with the idea of liquid as the ocean, as an ocean that is both promising good, but also the carrier of extremely bad phenomena. A watery grave, as well as something that is generative, like the liquid you speak about. And trace was what the minister is talking about, right? And maybe unconsciously connecting with decoloniality, right? Because decoloniality reminds us that coloniality is an ongoing phenomenon. It did not end. I mean, the colonialists would have us believe that it ended at a particular moment. That would be such a relief. But it isn't so, because it is structural, it's systemic. The project of modernity is exactly about coloniality. And decoloniality helps us to think about how memory as well is as much about the past as it is about the present. So we are triggered to think about the past. It's not because we want to, because we are just pessimistic, miserable people. We are triggered to think about why do we have this depression around us? Why do we have the sense of foreboding? And that comes because contemporary circumstances conspire to make us think about that past. And so that's where you had the traces. I hope that helps.
Thank you very much. That was fantastic. Moving on, we also have these kind of terms. We have the term traces. We have the term also, I guess, diaspora as well. And I never like to assume anything. I never like to assume what people may know about terminology, especially when people come to these kinds of talks, because I think they should also be informative and educational. And I wanted to throw out this, again, very large term, such as diaspora, to you all, and ask what it means, and then what it means for you, because I think that in the nature of a diaspora, something being spread across the world, it's deeply unique to the individual, to the culture, to your history. And maybe also a second part of the question is, how do you find it reflects in your work, in your research, in your maybe performance? Whoever would like to begin.
I mean, for me, I think I am the diaspora. I think the diaspora runs through me. I am a product of these different cultures coming together, and maybe not in a positive sense, but it's just what I am. I am the diaspora, and I think one of the nuances and factors of that, I think there are so many external parts that make us so different. So it's hard to explain that I am a product of this lineage, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And in my work, every academic text I read, I have to read it with a grain of salt, because I'm not only a reflection of that, but I'm mirroring that in each paper I write, in each research I do. I'm like, okay, where do I go with this? What is my perspective? How do I translate this to my being and into my, not in my sense of self only, but also in trying to, in art history, a very Western white space, trying to dissect that and see where, you know, the influences and perspectives came from that I'm trying to, okay, I don't agree with this. How do I translate that? How do I voice my opinion without it coming off as harsh, maybe, or abrasive? So, yeah.
Harsh and abrasive are always okay.
Yes, I was just about to say, can you say more about harsh and abrasive?
Yes. Yeah. I'm still trying to figure out what that means for me. Also coming a bit like in the same background as Christl, from the University of Amsterdam, where I feel that the people I feel connected to, on an intimate family level and on a community level, how is written about them. Sometimes I seem to identify myself with that, but at the same, most of the times it's like I do not see myself in this.
Yeah.
And how do I then make work that does show who I am or who we are together? I see it also a bit of as a responsibility to find ways to connect. Living here in the Netherlands, being born in South Africa, going there a lot, making work there too. Where does it all kind of come together? Because the traces are there, the history is there of the relationships that ties us together. But I sometimes feel like I'm still figuring out what that means for me. And then I try to do that through portraiture.
Thank you.
Yeah, for me, the idea of a group existing outside of its homeland, the scatteredness that I mentioned before, is it's starting to be okay. Like, I always thought about it as like fragmentation, but it's starting to crystallize for me in a way where it's like the same has happened with trees. Like, like the same has happened with different seeds that like come across borders and then flourish in different forests. Like, I feel like the same happens with mycelium, with mushrooms. Like, it's a network, an underground network of seeds that then find each other in seemingly alien places. Like, this is a network. Like, it's a couple of threads that have rewoven and in a very unlikely situation. And I feel like when I make my work, and what I'm finding, it wasn't necessarily an intention when I started to produce poems that I would find my tribe, but that's what has happened. Like, every time I write something, it connects with different people, and that is how the diaspora serves me. And it's not just people of color, it is people who are colorfully minded. And I feel like we need to lean in a little bit more in that direction and broaden the possibilities of this scatteredness, that there's opportunities there, especially through art.
And maybe adding on to your point of the scatteredness, it's also who fits under this term? What is the type of person that fits under this really broad term of traces, and who divulge in that?
Everyone.
And it maybe inadequately captures the nuances of the different experiences one or each person might have under roots or the diaspora.
I think that's a really great point. I wanted to ask you about exactly that. And the terminologies that we use or that can be used, whether it is maybe liquid traces, maybe it is diaspora, maybe it's a collective experience,
BIPOC art, maybe.
BIPOC art or the Black experience, so on and so forth. And I wanted to ask you about the limitations of terminology, especially in relation to the idea of a homogeneous experience or the homogeny of the diaspora.
Yeah, no, that's a really hard question to answer. But I think a huge part of that is context and the nuances being given by political, historical, colonial heritage, references made by each specific artist that is trying to make art, and also given context of breaking through in maybe a white space that is something like the museum, which is predominantly white. The art history is very white, very Western. So trying to break into that and being categorized as a label under a race is also really different than what we've seen before, where it's region-based, where it's time and place-based. The Gouden Eeuw is like 17th history, golden age, which is categorically also different than what this is racially defined. It's like this subcategory of art that is part of this bigger movement, and which I agree with because it gives also a sense of homogeny and a shared identity, a shared community. Solidarity, yes, which it has its positives, but I'm also questioning if that loses some of the individuality and kind of not equality, but maybe the the intersectionality of it. I don't know how you feel with that being
Like
creative
some
artist.
of the specificity of the individual experiences.
Right, exactly that.
Maybe it's also partly to do with the context in which the work is being discussed or shown. You mentioned, in particular, in this instance, in relation to visual art, you mentioned, for example, operating within institutions, predominantly white institutions, and I guess my next question is the current positioning that you find yourselves in, and the idea of in the collective or the collective and individual responsibility, especially if you're put in a position where you are racialized, but also if your work is political, if your work does talk about your identity, your work does talk about yourself in relation to a system in which you're living in, how, I guess, can or is it possible or should you be able to, I guess, try and change and dismantle a system whilst existing within it? And maybe what responsibility does that put on the individual as well within a space?
If I can talk about my own work, which I of course can.
Yes, please do.
This project that I started with my 3 brothers during the first lockdown of the pandemic in 2020.
Please mention the name of the project.
Yes. Julia Beth actually helped me with the title because I was thinking about Be Young Boy, Be Young Man, as it was first predominantly about them and growing up on this very Dutch typical agricultural farm that we grew up on. But when you think about the image of Dutch farmers, they are mostly white men in clogs and overalls, but we grew up in clogs and overalls, but with curly hair, with braids, with golden chains, with Tupac t-shirts. And I thought that if we don't fit in that image, I want to create an image of us and for us. And the first person I showed this work to said this work is very political, and I didn't really see it. I was just thinking about who are we, how can we let photography represent us, but that did trigger something in me, because then I thought, if this work is political, maybe I should consider what it means to be South African, what it means to be classified as a colored person, as those stories. My family history within South Africa was never shared with me, and I had to research and figure that out for myself. And when then on that path, figuring out that the Dutch had a relationship with South Africa that very much stems of colonialism, slavery, and apartheid, after realizing I was born in 1993, the last year that apartheid was still an official political ideology, that really did something to me. And that kind of steered me in a way of what kind of images, portrayals of identity, people and their identity has been put out there, as in academic work, but also, let's say, here by the bus stop, outside, in commercial work. How do I feel? Do I feel connected to that? And if I don't, I'm going to try to change that kind of image and say, hey, this is also actually how we want to see ourselves, and very much taking agency in that fact. But then I became more focused and taking little puzzle pieces of learning from how images were created, how identities were formed, how my identity was placed upon me without me having a say about that. And I said, I don't want to live within that kind of mental, physical space anymore. I want to step out of that and create it for myself, and then talk about my brothers. What does that then also mean for them? Because The eldest one is 21, 17, and 13, and the eldest two were very much already busy with that process for themselves, and I was actually very much inspired by them of doing their hair, thinking about do-rags, buying the clothes, watching movies as Straight Out of Compton, while we're all doing that on Dutch soil. And I thought, if both is our heritage, there's also these Dutch aspects of clogs and overalls and Delft blue vases. I want to put it all together and create our own puzzle, and that became the body of work in that sense.
Thank you. That was a wonderful explanation of the work and the images that we're seeing. To, I guess, go back to the original question, also in relation to Farren's work, how do you find it, I guess, again, functioning within particular spaces or institutions? And do you ever, I guess, tire of this, I guess maybe you don't, but maybe you do, tire of a feeling of maybe resistance or having to constantly open a conversation or educate people on topics which you deal with within your research and within your work?
Yes, it's tiring, definitely. And I think the more awareness there is around that extra labor that people in minority cultures do, the better. The more we can integrate that into society and as general knowledge, the better. I think. I think one of the lines of the poem here is. You say those reaping benefits may not be aware of the flip side of their advantage. And I think about how that leaves it only to the other side to feel the damage. And I think the less awareness there is around, or the less we talk about the damage that colonialism and prevailing systems of whiteness, how much that burdens the other side. The lighter that will become, and the more we can share that situation. And then I think with regards to art and whether putting it in your art is burdensome, or if there is a role for homogenous umbrellas of blackness, I feel like Farren's work has demonstrated, the more specific you can become about your lived experience, the better. I think the more specific we all become about our lived experience, the clogs and the Tupac T-shirts, the cornrows and the cornfields, that's real. And then the more we'll, I think, be able to draw from the wells of newness that are actually all around us, but that we do not acknowledge because everybody is in a social construct. That's limiting. So having to make space for that in dominantly white spaces, from my personal experience, to answer the question, is fatiguing. Yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you. Mm-hmm. We have a hand.
Yay.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for this conversation so far. I just wanted to mention something about the question you just asked before that one, where you mentioned how are you guys thinking, or how are you experiencing, sorry, I'm going to express myself in a weird way, when you try to sort of dismantle this system or criticize it while you're still part of it. And I thought of a concept that I really, really like and that might inspire you, which is called constructive resistance, and which thinks of resistance as, first of all, thinks of itself as not... Oh, sorry. as like social change cannot happen in like some sort of bubble that is separate from the overall system, right? Rather, we're always connected in some way to it, and the structure exists, and it's entangled, like you very well described as well. It's like this super full of nods thing that takes roots in histories and has plenty of legacies. Yet you guys here are building these like alternative structures and are making like new nodes. And maybe one day these nodes will like be the new dominating one. But basically you're building alternative to the oppressive structures that are existing in our current system, yet you're doing it in the here and now. And this is happening simultaneously, well, you get it, to the other nodes, right? So yeah, that's just a very relevant concept, I think. So yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Christl, do you have anything that you would like to add?
I was just thinking about what Farren was talking about in her formulating her identity and these different aspects that's come into play. And I kind of call it micro-activism, where I think our entire being itself is this activism in itself. Every paper I read, everything I dissect is this constant different narration of what I'm trying to get out of this, you know, what I'm trying to write about, what I'm trying to see and envision. Being inspired by writers like Fanon and Baba, and trying to get those perspectives in line with my nuances. So that in itself is already this, forms my navigation of those spaces. So yeah, I agree. It can be tiring, and
Sure.
but it also excites me to see what not only I am learning, but what my classmates are learning per se, and like hearing their opinions and seeing kind of what their references are and what they're referencing to, and how they're pickpocketing what I'm saying. So that's also...
I like that you use pickpocketing.
And that's my statement.
So on that topic, I'm glad you ended by discussing your studies, but also as an art historian. I wanted to open the question again to everyone, but in particular to you in relation to talking about, I think, visual culture and also, I guess, history and the idea of, or not the idea, the reality of what has been written and who has written that. And this is not exclusive just to visual culture. But I think it ties very closely to also the senses of urgency in everything that you do. It's an urgency to kind of act and to counteract a dominant narrative. So I thought maybe you could talk about some of your, I guess, research maybe, or thoughts that you have at the moment.
Yeah, so I just mentioned Baba, and he has this really great concept of a third space, which is like this gray area where, I mean, also the diaspora comes together and can actually express themselves, be themselves. And I was talking to Farren about this, where this space of gray area you talked about in your entire being also allows you to have that freedom. He talks about this in a more macro level of a cultural sense and an actual concept of people coming together. But I think it also reflects into artwork being made by this, by the diaspora, where there's place for hybridity and duality in our identity. And that being expressed itself in this gray area gives us this freedom to also create new research into that and new terminology for that. So I think those are where my research is going now, and what's really interesting to me. I don't know how you feel.
I have a question.
Yeah, no, go ahead.
For you, another one.
Yeah,
sorry.
go ahead.
more to kind of, I guess, dive into as an art historian, maybe you could talk and you could share with the audience some of the, I guess, dominant narratives that you have had to, I guess, encounter, but also unpick in your studies and in, I guess, the ways in which, people are written about, and how maybe that influences the ways in which we see.
Definitely. And I think now also in this age, and especially at the UVA, there's research going into their colonial history. And maybe I'm a bit biased, but I'm also asking these questions of who is researching this, what perspectives are they using, what references are they using, what framework are they creating to do this research. Which is an ongoing process, of course, and everybody's learning out of that. But for me, definitely take, for example, the painting of Manet with Olympia, and then just now recently they found out the name of the black servant that was next to her, and giving her a name and giving her this, oh, she was part of this French history, and divulging in her her body and trying to dissect that through an art historian way of thinking, or looking at iconography of what she's holding, or how she's dressed, or how she's being presented. Also, there's a lot of ways to reach that point of interest. So you could research that based off how she's dressed, or the way he painted her, what kind of paints he used, or those aspects are various, but it's still I feel, in my opinion, being researched not by the right people. And
can you expand on what you mean by the right people?
I think the right people being maybe the people of the diaspora, but also just people who have that layered context of what position she was in at that point. And that not only being brought over by someone who has done the research into how she's dressed, or how she's being represented, but someone who adds those layers of contextualizing her being at that stage.
For whom it is more than a theory.
For whom it is more than a theory, who have lived through that and who are the product of that. So, I think in vague terms, that's what I mean. Yeah.
I didn't think it was vague. Thank you. Thanks. As a hand. Oh, there's two hands. Wonderful. We'll go here, then there.
Thank you. Hi.
Hello.
I just wanted. Oh, you're gonna hold this one. Thank you. I'm very happy with that. Thanks. I just wanted to add to what Christl was saying. I know we have a lot of stories about us and our history, and I happen to follow a historian as well. Her name is Fiona Compton, and she studies our history of slavery, but also through Caribbean culture and what it all means. And I think it's very important that we, thank you, acknowledge that the people who are researching us, because of the history and the negative connotations that have been added to Black people, people of color, and Caribbean people, that sometimes it's hard to, when you have something that is of value to other people, it's hard to get that message out if people always have a negative connotation because you're not going to try it. Yeah. For instance, in one text written by a white person, I think it was a colonizer, I'm not sure, don't quote me, but he was speaking of vulgar dances and vulgar movements of the slaves. And to him, it's vulgar because there's already a negative connotation for people with Black skin. But to us, to people who are Black, people in the diaspora, movement can be very freeing. There can be energy release. It can be very healing. But if there's a negative connotation of vulgar, of disgusting, of wrong, I'm not going to try it. I'm going to be scared to move my hips or twerk. But without that negative connotation, in the context of someone who understands it and understands African culture, understands what that means, if they describe it, if they have an open mind to it, then you'll be more inclined to try it and to see if it works for you. And maybe it can be a healing experience. It can be a freeing experience. And that's what we are missing in the diaspora. Sometimes we have very heavy emotions, hard times, and without the tools that are from our ancestors, tools that are intuitively in us that we're scared to try, we stay with the heavy energy and the heavy emotions when it could be released. So that's also, it's very subtle and intricate, but it's a small thing that can have a very big influence on a big group of people, and it's unfortunate.
What I love that she mentions is the Eurocentric view that was placed on our being, and dissecting that is part of the struggle she's talking about. So I really understand that. And,
Thank you.
Take the shackles off my feet so I can dance.
yes,
That's what I thought about. I was like, yes.
That's fantastic. Thank you very much for your comments. And can I go over to the back now? There was also another hand.
Hi, I just want to kind of ask a question, going back to what the diaspora is and what the diaspora means for you as creators, as well as academics working in predominantly white space. I mean, you're an art historian, which is like, kudos, love it. And like all of you do amazing things, but do you do it in contradiction to the white diaspora that is going on, or to the colonial thought, or do you do it as you in yourself? One question. And then the second one is, I'm also from South Africa, so I came in with a knowledge of, okay, I have enough working knowledge of Europe. I encountered the diaspora in Europe. In Africa, I didn't learn about African diasporic knowledge, or what I'm doing is somehow different because I thought academia is academia, and therefore we move on not as a person of color in academia, not as a different perspective, as a measure of we had equal education. So where on the spectrum or on the path do we get to the point of I am undoing what has been done to a generation, or I am redoing? So you have all of these intricate, like she said, the intricate knots of colonialism. Am I undoing, am I doing, or am I creating a third space? Yeah.
Well, that's a great question. Both of them were great questions.
Yeah. I'd say I think one of the gifts of living sort of out of context and, like, you know, being an African in the West is that it's given me perspective. Like, you know, it's taken me as a fish out of water and put me on, like, let's say, soil, and has shown me in that way how I'm different, and I can use that point of difference to be authentic. And I think that's the greatest, most effective activism and most relaxing activism I can do also, is to find my authentic voice. And then whatever I do naturally is decolonial, because it's, coming from my gut and from a place of self-discovery. It's coming from inward rather than basing what I do on outward impositions. And that's been a long journey. Like, you know, I've been living here for 12 years now, and like only now I'm starting to understand seeds that were planted many years ago that are only now starting to sprout its first leaves, you know. And it, for me, not to say that that's a process that takes that long for everybody else, but for me it did, like more than a decade. And but, you know, better late than never. And and it's a process to be embraced, and it's worth it, you know, to find yourself and to thereby usher other people into finding their authentic voices as well.
I also have an answer, I think, in relation to I think working within academia and working within predominantly white spaces. And recently a lot of people have been saying, when you think about the term decolonization or decolonial thought, it's this, again, the kind of caveat of like thought, right? And that it's a theory as opposed to something which is existing within you, and it's something which naturally is a part of people, individuals, and through existing and through being authentic, through being yourself, you work against a dominant narrative, and you work against, I guess, also a Eurocentric way of seeing the world. And I think sometimes we ask that we have to define it and explain it as well. And I think sometimes through defining and explanation, depending on the spaces in which you're in, you also find yourself then again in the position of the educator, or in the position of the minority, right? And I often like to think, at least for myself, when you talk about decolonialism, it's actually a practice of the global majority. Mm-hmm. It's not a minority. It doesn't fit into a subculture or a small way of thinking. I just wanted to throw my hat into the ring. But please,
thank you. I also feel, for myself, I'm always doing the work for me, and especially the people who I am portraying, because I feel like I have a responsibility to them too. But I'm also working with the system, but also working against it. I want to learn a lot about how the system functions, which narratives are being told, let's say, about people of color, about colored people within South Africa, but also those who move here. And once I have that knowledge, and once I feel that it doesn't really work, I tend to figure out what then works for me. So then I'm creating my own little system within the work. Sometimes I also say I FUCK around, I don't want to swear, with ideas. For instance, this image of my eldest brother with my mom about doing hair. For me, it feels like we are actually somewhere on the streets of Johannesburg, where you have these ladies sitting outside shipping containers on the streets in the city center, braiding hair, but as a means of survival. And for us, we're just sitting outside of a farm that's actually ours. It's our piece of land, which feels for me very weird. And being a colored person my grandparents were displaced to colored neighborhoods, and finding out that being on the farm felt for me very weird, to have this piece of land. And what does it then mean that we also get to do our hair on this piece of land, knowing that in Johannesburg, it happens in the city center, it's way more bustling. Whereas this almost feels like then I'm flipping the system to being farm, at being a bit more rural. So it's all kind of this dance that's happening. It just depends on what I read, how I feel about that, and then if I can figure out something that does work for me. And sometimes that's also a very long process. That also happens in this gray space. Because if I say, no, this doesn't work for me, but then what does? And sometimes I actually really don't know what's going to work for me, but I might just figure it out. But the fact that I have that freedom to figure it out really helps a lot. So I just do it for yourself.
Yeah.
Mm. I have to say I wasn't very confronted with much literature about decolonial thought when I was living in Suriname. So for me, it's a very new experience, and through this also getting to find out what my identity means to me and myself, and how many traces form that. And also the privilege of having that experience is really big for me, that I get to be in this position of learning about that and dissecting that for myself. While what Farren just said, that the braiding of the hair being a means of survival there is very confrontational of the the privilege I have here, and that I get to relate what not only my identity is as an individual, but also my Surinamese ancestral decolonial identity. And doing that through my academic research also means that I get to experience, I think, maybe a westernized layer of looking at what the totality of my identity and my country's identity is.
So looking through a particular gaze or a particular lens.
Yeah, and being formed by my experiences here.
Mm-hmm.
So that's also this other layer of,
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Thank you. They're fantastic question, and I'm glad that it kind of triggered a new flow. And I want to talk about, I guess, storytelling. You're all storytellers, or you work with stories. You tell your own stories through your research. And I wanted to ask about this idea of kind of telling your stories uninhibited, telling your stories with pure freedom and without constraints. And I guess, what does freedom look like to you, in the senses of being able to express yourself in whatever way works for you?
No fear.
No fear.
Like Nina Simone said.
Yeah.
Just no fear of what comes up, in other poetry series, I've also written about sexuality, about queerness, about blackness is only one thing that I'm writing about, but there's so many. I write about ancestors, spirituality. I dare to write about spirituality, especially in a construct where, or in a society where God is a bad word. I've really explored multiple parts of my identity and what was given to me. So, and I think just unashamedly making space for that, also within your own mind and within your own ideas of what you're allowed to say and what you're not allowed to say. Allowing space for my multiplicity, and daring to speak on that, even though it's sometimes uncomfortable at first. But it's healthy discomfort to, discover parts of yourself that you were maybe ashamed of before. There's a lot of pride and shame around identity, and those are the bastions of what really gives us the illusion of separateness, and just taking pride and shame away and daring to speak on it.
The accepting of the self.
Yes.
And maybe saying something that might be outlandish or might fall into...
That's the good stuff.
Yeah. It gets the conversation going.
Yeah, but also when you dare that, other people also have an inner narrative that they have been maybe trying to hide that part of themselves, and you give other people also permission to, be outlandish. That's the authenticity we're talking about. When you make space for yourself, you make space for others as well to, be authentic, whatever that may be, and then you have to allow that and, flow with that. And
maybe even sit in it.
Yes. Not judge it.
Definitely. When I'm making my work, I tend to do that. I'm allowing myself to create without any baggage of how people will perceive the work, how they will talk about it, what their idea of my work will be. I tend to filter or kind of just not have that with me while I'm making, and focus on what is happening in front of me, and does this feel right? Because there's always a gut feeling. When I speak about identity, sometimes I tend to very much say that words can't translate identity, because it is a lived experience, and how can words do your lived experience justice. So then to answer if words cannot do that, for me, it then is merely portraiture within photography. And somebody also once asked me, do you think about galleries or museums when you make this work? And I was like, hell no. I was like, I can't do that. I can't think about, oh, this gallery has South African artists. Should I then like bend and squeeze and become this worm that can fit into there and then maybe get in there? And I was like, then I'm not really listening to myself anymore. Then I'm trying to mold myself as a piece of clay into a system that is out there, and I'm trying to figure out who am I.
And also, sorry to interrupt, also a system that doesn't have you in mind.
Exactly. Yes. So that's just, yes. I'm just figuring out who am I and who is on there with me, and how do we want to be ourselves. Yes, in that kind of sense. And then what we have also been speaking about, then dealing later, how do you convey this work to a museum or to a gallery or to whoever wants to listen or see the work.
I wanted to touch on what you were saying about trying to bend yourself and bend your work into a place where it doesn't have you in mind. Mm-hmm. And that really, I think, resonates in some of the conversations we had before now. Mm-hmm. I wish I like to say that this was the first time we're all meeting, but it's obviously not. We also discussed, for example, the exhibition of the work of the wonderful Ernest Cole that was at Foam that closed a couple of months ago. And I wanted to maybe bring that up as a kind of topic in the sense of talking about institutional failure. And yeah.
It hurts. I mean,
for context, those who don't know, Ernest Cole was a very famous South African photographer who also documented apartheid very thoroughly, religiously, and his work was really pivotal to the resistance against the apartheid regime.
Mm-hmm. Yes, as he identified himself as a black man mm-hmm. who went through the system to be identified as a colored, mm-hmm. to gain access and more freedom in moving space to create the work that he created. And seeing his work in Foam as an institution here on that soil, but then while reading everything and going through it and not finding a section where it was phrased that the Dutch helped architecture and implemented apartheid, the system I was born into, the system Cole was fighting with these images, it felt like I wasn't being seen, that my people were not being seen. I don't know if I can use this term, but it almost felt like a poverty porn mm-hmm. In that kind of sense, because the work aesthetically is amazing, but it's also provocative, and it's also a huge form of activism, and it feels like maybe those were the cornerstones to choose it, but I wouldn't say that I don't know. Mm. I was very happy, but also somewhat on the fence when they asked me to do a talk there. But I've very much made it very clear that I wanted to state the fact that that the Dutch helping implement apartheid, but also having a huge piece in colonialism and slavery there, why that wasn't there in the museum. And I was allowed that space, but I'm not sure what it triggered. And especially also talking about this years after what happened to George Floyd, and that triggered the Musea Bekende Kleur, museums acknowledge color. Now I don't know what that means. What does it mean that a museum is acknowledging color in their sense, but then choosing to have his work over here, but then not acknowledging,
not contextualizing it, the frameworking around it. Yeah,
exactly.
And you spoke about language, and you touched on the importance of language and text, and you also do in your work. And I wanted to maybe ask you, JB, talking about language and colonialism, and how does this inform the ways in which we go through the world, and also language in relation to diaspora and positioning, and how does that maybe feed into your work? Obviously, you're someone who is a poet, so of course you work with language.
Yeah.
But maybe in particular in relation to colonialism, decolonialism, and diaspora.
Well, I think words really need to be seen as fluid as well, and not. Words are things, but I think they are things that we can use to reclaim identities. Like there's a rewriting that needs to take place, and to put ourselves in the context of not only the present but also the future. I also feel like while words define, they can never, no matter how many poems I write about my lived experience, it can never necessarily define the experience of somebody else. But what words can do as things is spark imagination and make space in people's minds, hearts, spirits for their own interpretation and their own recontextualizing of their own identity. And I feel like we have to really look at words as liquid, look at identity as liquid, look at colonialism, blackness, whiteness, those constructs as also liquid and as things that are also subject to change like everything else. And that's how I approach words.
Yeah, but within that also, there are also a lot of limitation within terminology and vocab that's being used, like essentialism. For example, that there needs to be this assumption that diasporic art can only adhere to certain topics, so or this ambiguity of vague words being used to describe or criticize Black Indigenous art. That also leads to this, this acceleration of an Eurocentric bias about Black art. So there are limitations in vocab, and that being also, for me, using that and trying to figure out what words to use when describing, it's really hard.
And what languages to use as well.
Yeah. Well, we can sit together and workshop it.
I can see something else forming, which is wonderful.
Yes. I'll show you how to bend them.
And what about for you?
I think just like I said earlier, it works for me finding ways to translate them within images, because I tend to fight with them. I tend to fight with words a lot. All through my academic years, I had these harrowing fights with words to try to talk about what does an identity mean, what is a person, and raging wars in my mind. And then I felt once photography became more and more my thing, I felt that was my form of translation, that I hope that it would open up a sense or feeling within whoever gets to see the work, open them up to these ways of rethinking my narratives, where identity always had to be this one thing or this one nationality. You had to have, you could not be mixed blood. You had to have one specific lineage or line, which in itself was very limited. But then what does it mean if, for myself, I have Scottish, probably Dutch, Indian, and South African ancestors. What do words then do for me? And once I kind of said, I'm going to first figure it out through photography and then think about writing about the work, which I still tend to find very difficult. Yes, I just hope people just look at it and that it inspires them to rethink notions of identity in that sense.
Thank you very much. And I see that we're nearing towards the end of our discussion. So I would like to leave you, I guess, with one question. Working intentionally or unintentionally, is that something you want or you can control, do you feel, when it comes to your pursuits and the kind of things that you want to talk about and address in your work?
A healthy balance of both,
Mm-hmm.
you know. I think intention is important. Like, intention also comes from, like, you know, with authenticity, like, you know, knowing what you want to put out into the world, what kind of effect you have. But there is a subliminal space, like, you know, that comes out when we create, that's also very informative, like, you know, that happens when we dance, or, like, you know, when we cook, or, like, you know, where there's something to be said for the unconscious that can tap into muscle memory, collective memory from, like, you know, even past lives. There is a wealth of knowledge in the unconscious from dreams. Things that don't make sense usually inform your own sense making. So for me personally, I'd say a healthy balance of both. An intention to be unintentional.
Absolutely.
But to use it as a tool.
Fantastic.
Yes.
I don't think I have anything to add. I think I fully agree.
That's good. That's nice.
For me too, thinking about my work is only black and white, and I toyed with this idea of white people and black people, and how in South Africa during apartheid, all of us were segregated, even colored people. But the story was always said that when a white person comes together with a black person, that creates a colored person, a person of color. But I thought photography can't really translate that, or at least black and white photography can't, because if you mix white with black, you have gray, but you have an immense amount of shades of gray. And then I thought, if that is my intentional thought, what will happen in all of these shades of gray? And then everything unintentional has space to formulate and to come on this negative in that.
To emerge.
Yes, yeah, exactly.
Well, I'm going to end that there. Thank you so much. To Farren, to Christl, to Julia Beth for your incredible insights. Thank you to the audience for your questions, for your ears. Thank you to those of you who are at home watching or wherever you are. And it's been a pleasure listening to you all speak. I hope everyone leaves feeling invigorated and rejuvenated and full of thoughts and ideas. So thank you to all of you.
Thank you.
Thank you.